On June 21, 1970, the sudden collapse of a single corporate titan triggered a financial shockwave that threatened to paralyze the entire American economy. The Penn Central Transportation Company, a seemingly invincible behemoth, filed for bankruptcy without warning. It was the largest corporate failure in U.S. history up to that moment. Panic immediately seized Wall Street as investors realized the sheer scale of the disaster. Billions of dollars in shareholder value evaporated overnight. Trading floors descended into chaos as brokers scrambled to offload worthless paper. The sheer magnitude of the Penn Central filing shattered the bedrock of institutional confidence. This was not merely a troubled firm quietly closing its doors. It was a sprawling, continental empire suddenly freezing in its tracks. The financial markets had never witnessed an implosion of this magnitude. Beyond the frantic trading desks, a profound national panic began to take hold. The immediate stakes for the American public were terrifying and unprecedented. Mountains of coal sat unmoved in sprawling rail yards, threatening to plunge regional power grids into darkness. Millions of commuters in major eastern cities faced the sudden prospect of being entirely stranded. The physical arteries of commerce were rapidly hardening. A chilling realization swept through government halls and living rooms alike. The survival of the nation's daily life rested entirely in the hands of a single, failed private enterprise. If the train stopped running, food would rot in warehouses and factories would fall silent. The collapse laid bare a terrifying vulnerability in the modern supply chain. A private catastrophe was rapidly becoming a public emergency. To understand this catastrophic failure requires analyzing the origins of the two titans that formed this doomed conglomerate. For over a century, the Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central Railroad ruled the American landscape. They were undisputed monarchs of the industrial age, boasting massive physical assets that spanned half the continent. Their historic dominance was built on hauling the steel, coal, and passengers that fueled a growing nation. These were not just companies, but sovereign industrial states. A bitter, century-long rivalry defined their every move and shaped the geography of American commerce. The Pennsylvania and the New York Central fought ruthlessly for dominance over every vital freight route and passenger terminal. This intense competition drove them to construct monumental stations and lay thousands of miles of parallel track. Their relentless battle for supremacy forged the very foundation of the national economy. For decades, their wealth seemed absolute and permanent. However, the triumphant era of rail dominance met a brutal reckoning in the aftermath of the Second World War. A severe financial squeeze began to choke their once guaranteed profits. The rapid expansion of the new interstate highway system offered a faster, more flexible alternative for moving freight. Commercial trucking companies quickly began siphoning away the most lucrative shipping contracts. Simultaneously, the rise of commercial passenger airlines decimated their luxury travel revenues. The railroads found themselves trapped in a rigid, outdated business model. A new era of U.S. infrastructure regulation prevented them from easily abandoning unprofitable routes or adjusting their freight rates. They were bleeding cash while being legally forced to maintain massive, decaying physical networks. The transportation paradigm had fundamentally shifted beneath their feet. The former monarchs of industry were now struggling simply to survive the decade. Behind closed mahogany doors, a grim boardroom realization finally took hold. Neither railroad giant could survive alone in this unforgiving new landscape. Decades of bitter animosity were abruptly set aside in the face of mutual annihilation. Executive leadership began drafting a desperate proposal to combine their sprawling empires. They envisioned creating the ultimate transportation monopoly to weather the economic storm. This unprecedented merger was driven by the hope that combining forces would instantly eliminate thousands of miles of redundant routes. Proponents argued that a unified mega railroad would drastically cut overhead and restore financial invincibility. The plan was hailed as a brilliant strategic maneuver to save a dying industry. Yet this ambitious attempt to engineer survival would soon unleash a bureaucratic disaster. The foundation for the ultimate corporate collapse had just been laid. The grand vision of a streamlined mega railroad immediately collided with the grinding machinery of federal oversight. The Interstate Commerce Commission, the powerful agency governing American transportation, subjected the proposal to an agonizing 10-year regulatory battle. Regulators scrutinized every detail of the merger, terrified of the unprecedented monopoly power it would create. Hearings dragged on as competing railroads, labor unions, and local politicians fought to protect their own interests. When the Interstate Commerce Commission finally signaled approval, it came with devastating legal strings attached. To appease powerful labor unions, regulators mandated extreme job protections that legally prevented the new company from firing thousands of redundant workers. The immediate cost-cutting measures that executives had promised Wall Street were suddenly outlawed by federal decree. The financial logic underpinning the entire merger was crippled before a single contract was signed. The ultimate regulatory concession proved to be a fatal poison pill for the newly formed empire. The government forced the merging giants to absorb the New Haven Railroad, a heavily indebted and failing passenger line serving New England. This mandate was not a strategic acquisition, but a desperate government bailout shifted onto private ledgers. The New Haven was hemorrhaging money, its infrastructure crumbling, and its operations entirely unprofitable. Swallowing this bankrupt entity acted as a massive financial parasite on the new corporation. Vital cash reserves, desperately needed to integrate the two main railroads, were immediately siphoned off to keep the New Haven passenger trains running. Instead of combining strength, the merger had forcefully chained a drowning company to an already struggling enterprise. The promised financial invincibility evaporated under the weight of this forced absorption. On February 1, 1968, the Penn Central Transportation Company officially began operations, but the reality on the ground was catastrophic. Instead of a streamlined industrial giant, immediate physical chaos erupted across the sprawling rail yards. Massive freight trains were misrouted into dead-end sidings, while highly perishable cargo sat rotting in stalled boxcars. The meticulously planned corporate launch instantly devolved into a sprawling, multi-state logistical nightmare. Frantic yardmasters stared at overflowing tracks, entirely unable to locate priority shipments or dispatch waiting locomotives. Thousands of freight cars seemingly vanished into the wrong states, lost within a colossal network that had suddenly gone blind. Switching yards in major hubs became paralyzed as trains arrived with no clear destination or unloading instructions. The physical arteries of American commerce were rapidly clogging under the sheer weight of disorganized scale. This operational paralysis was rooted in a profound technical disaster at the very heart of the merger. The Pennsylvania and New York Central divisions relied on entirely different, thoroughly incompatible computer systems for tracking freight. The digital architecture that governed one half of the company could not communicate with the other. Automated routing protocols failed instantly, severing the vital flow of information needed to move physical goods. Without a unified digital network, critical shipping data had to be processed by hand. Clerks were forced to manually translate thousands of complex waybills between the two legacy systems, introducing massive delays and catastrophic human errors. A single mistyped digit could send a load of industrial steel to a rural passenger depot instead of a manufacturing plant. The technological bridge between the two empires simply did not exist. The technical failures were violently amplified by a bitter internal warfare that consumed the new workforce. Employees divided themselves into hostile factions, known derisively as the Red Team for the Pennsylvania veterans and the Green Team for the New York legacy staff. Executives from rival backgrounds flatly refused to share vital operational information with their new counterparts. Decades of ingrained corporate hatred could not be erased by a boardroom signature. This toxic culture clash trickled down to every level of the organization. Middle managers actively sabotaged each other's operations, deliberately withholding resources to make rival departments look incompetent to senior leadership. Employee morale plummeted as the daily reality of working for the merged behemoth became an exercise in frustration and hostility. The Penn Central was not functioning as a unified company, but as a corporate civil war. To mask this catastrophic operational bleeding from Wall Street, executive management at the Penn Central pivoted toward an aggressive strategy of corporate diversification. The leaders of the struggling transportation behemoth decided that if the trains could not generate a profit, they would buy companies that could. They began funneling millions of dollars into non-railroad assets, effectively transforming the enterprise into a sprawling real estate syndicate. This desperate pivot included massive, debt-fueled investments in high-profile properties, most notably acquiring a controlling stake in Madison Square Garden. By acquiring glamorous real estate in New York and amusement parks elsewhere, executives hoped to create a facade of robust financial health. They used complex accounting maneuvers to blend these new revenues with their failing core business, projecting an illusion of stability to the public markets. This elaborate shell game birthed the fatal financial mechanism that ultimately doomed the company. To keep shareholders pacified and stock prices elevated, the board of directors insisted on paying out consistently high dividends. However, because the actual railroad generated no operating profit, these payouts were funded entirely through the continuous issuance of short-term commercial paper. The company was essentially taking out brief, high-interest loans just to write dividend checks to its own investors. This created a perilous reliance on a continuous cycle of rolling debt, where new loans were constantly required to pay off the old ones. It was a classic financial trap, leaving the corporation entirely dependent on the daily goodwill of the credit markets. While executives engineered these financial illusions in quiet boardrooms, the physical reality on the ground was rapidly disintegrating. Decades of deferred maintenance left the vast network of tracks in a state of dangerous, visible decay. Rotting wooden ties and degraded steel rails transformed once reliable corridors into hazardous zones. The degraded infrastructure triggered a terrifying surge in fiery, catastrophic derailments that routinely destroyed valuable freight. To prevent entire trains from vibrating off the shattered tracks, dispatchers were forced to issue thousands of slow orders across the network. Massive, heavily loaded freight trains were reduced to crawling at a mere 10 miles per hour, destroying any remaining schedule reliability. This fragile, decaying system was entirely unprepared for the environmental assault that arrived in late 1969. A historically brutal winter descended upon the Northeast and Midwest, burying the already crippled infrastructure under relentless snow and ice. The extreme cold snapped brittle rails and completely froze the aging mechanical switches required to route traffic. Thousands of loaded cars were stranded in frozen rail yards for days, unable to move forward or return to their origins. The physical network essentially paralyzed, triggering a total collapse in daily freight revenue, just as the company needed cash the most. The harsh weather stripped away the last remaining veneer of operational competence. By early 1970, the financial music abruptly stopped. Wall Street analysts finally pierced the accounting veil and realized that the underlying commercial paper was virtually worthless. The staggering debt load, combined with the catastrophic drop in winter freight revenue, exposed the company as fundamentally insolvent. Panic swept through the financial sector, causing the credit markets to completely and instantly freeze. Banks flatly refused to roll over the short-term loans or issue new commercial paper, abruptly shutting off the lifeblood of cash that had kept the illusion alive. Without access to daily borrowing, the largest transportation monopoly in the U.S. was suddenly left facing imminent bankruptcy. In the late spring of 1970, Penn Central executives descended on Washington in a state of absolute desperation, carrying ledgers that bled red ink. Behind the closed doors of federal offices, they pleaded with the Nixon administration for an emergency $200 million loan guarantee. The White House was forced into a tense political calculus. Lawmakers weighed the catastrophic threat of frozen supply lines against the terrible optics of rescuing gross corporate incompetence. They debated furiously over whether the federal government had a fiduciary duty to save a failing transportation monopoly. Saving it seemed necessary only because its collapse would paralyze the national economy. In a shocking and unprecedented move, the Nixon administration simply said no. The government concluded that the corporate bureaucracy was too bloated and fundamentally mismanaged to justify a taxpayer rescue. This decision shattered the long-held Wall Street assumption that some corporations were simply too big to fail. In June 1970, the Penn Central Transportation Company officially filed for bankruptcy protection. The massive legal filing instantly wiped out billions of dollars in shareholder equity. It triggered the largest and most complex corporate collapse in American history up to that very moment. The immediate human cost of this decision was staggering. The pain rippled rapidly outward from the mahogany boardrooms to the gritty rail yards. Thousands of dedicated railroad workers suddenly found their livelihoods destroyed. They stared down the grim reality of evaporated pensions and an industry in total freefall. Everyday investors suffered a profound psychological shock, helplessly watching their life savings vanish overnight. Generations of families had treated railroad dividend stock as a bedrock asset. They believed the massive infrastructure giant was as safe, stable, and secure as the United States Treasury itself. This spectacular implosion forced a massive structural shift in how the state handles critical infrastructure. The government was compelled to intervene directly to prevent the complete abandonment of passenger rail service. This emergency action led to the creation of Amtrak, fundamentally altering the landscape of federal transportation regulation. The subsequent formation of the government-funded Conrail system absorbed the decaying freight lines. This move essentially nationalized the physical wreckage of the failed merger. The sweeping legislative intervention established a lasting legal precedent. It dictated how governments must step in when private monopolies fail to maintain the vital arteries of commerce. Beyond the sweeping legislative changes, the permanent scars of the collapse lingered heavily. Industrial communities had built their civic identities around the railroad, and now they faced ruin. Entire towns that once thrived on the steady rhythm of the freight yards were devastated. They were left to manage the quiet decay of abandoned tracks. For the working families who lost their financial security, the failure remained a bitter lesson. It was a generational warning about the absolute limits of corporate power. The ledger of the merger was ultimately balanced, not by the executives who engineered it. The final toll was paid by the ordinary citizens left holding the empty promises. The collapse of the Penn Central Transportation Company fundamentally altered the American economic landscape. For decades, policymakers assumed rigid regulation would guarantee the stability of critical infrastructure. The 1970 bankruptcy shattered that assumption. It proved a bloated monopoly, stifled by bureaucracy, could not survive on scale alone. This forced a drastic shift in federal strategy. Analyzing the wreckage, lawmakers recognized that survival required flexibility rather than forced consolidation. This ideological pivot paved the way for the sweeping deregulation of the U.S. railroad industry. Markets were finally untethered from the sluggish oversight that doomed the historic merger between the Pennsylvania and New York lines. The disaster established a new paradigm. It proved that no corporate giant was simply too big to fail. Today, the grand ambitions of that ultimate monopoly exist only in archived ledgers and worthless stock certificates. Beneath the modern hum of revitalized freight corridors, the ghosts of the old empire remain. They linger in rusted switch yards and overgrown branch lines scattered across the Northeast. These quiet ruins stand as a permanent monument to hubris. They remind us that even the most invincible engines of wealth can eventually derail.